Well, good evening again, brethren, and we'll be in Genesis chapter 49, and I'll be reading from verse 22 onwards, and Jacob's prayer and blessing upon Joseph. But let's once again pray. Lord, we thank you for your word, and you said that you will look to this man who trembles at your word, and we pray tonight that as we come to it, that each of us might have that right reverence, that right response to that which you would say. Grant us ears, and we pray spiritual eyes to hear, and we thank you for the privilege that it is given to us to know the mysteries of the kingdom of heaven, that you have graciously revealed them to us by your Spirit and through your word. And so we pray tonight that our eyes might be further opened and our hearts enlarged as we follow Christ. Amen. Well, Genesis chapter 49 and verse 22. Joseph is a fruitful bough, even a fruitful bough by a well, whose branches run over the wall. The archers have sorely grieved him and shot at him and hated him, but his bow abode in strength, and the arms of his hands were made strong by the hands of the mighty God of Jacob. From thence is the shepherd, the stone of Israel, even by the God of thy father, who shall help thee, and by the Almighty, who shall bless thee with blessings of heaven and above, blessings of the deep that lieth under, blessings of the breasts and of the womb. The blessings of thy father have prevailed above the blessing of my progenitors, unto the utmost bound of the everlasting hills. They shall be on the head of Joseph, and on the crown of the head of him that was separate from his brethren. Well, I'd like to continue on tonight with a little bit more about the life and faith of Joseph, and if I might call tonight overcoming faith, because really the life of Joseph is such an example of that. We're rightly, aren't we, drawn to the life of Job to see the patience of Job and his long suffering, and see the end of the Lord and how merciful and tenderly God actually dealt with Job through his great affliction. Well, Joseph's experiences were very, very similar, and yet, as we read here in Genesis 49, he bore much fruit through that experience. You see, by way of very brief background, you may remember that Abraham had been told by God that his descendants would be through much trial in Egypt for 400 years. And the beginning of this is Joseph going forth into Egypt, sold as a slave, falsely accused of adultery and of attempting to rape a woman, which he far from it didn't, but he upheld his integrity and his walk with God, and yet it was upheld by the Lord there. And we might say, well, how was it that Joseph endured such affliction? How was it that he was so faithful and maintained his walk with God? Well, in chapter 49, for those not familiar with it, this is after Jacob, his father, and all of Joseph's brothers have come to Egypt, following Joseph down there. And this is almost Jacob's last words as he prays for each of his children. But he not only prays, he also describes their experience that they've been through, but also he gives some prophetic utterances in scripture, as we have here, about what will come. Hence where we read about how from thence is the shepherd, the stone of Israel, and all these things point to our Lord Jesus Christ ultimately. But I'd like to speak tonight about Joseph's overcoming faith, as how was it that he endures, and yet he's described in verse 22 as a fruitful bough, that is a fruitful branch or a fruitful young tree, and he describes him as a fruitful bough by a well, whose branches run over the wall. And I was with the children out over the course of this week in a lovely park near to here, and there was just that. There was someone's back garden with a stone wall around it, and there was an apple tree in it, and its branches were overflowing over the top of the wall and were full of apples. They weren't confined by the wall that marked the perimeter of that property. And you could say the same with Joseph, that he went beyond that lot of fruitfulness that should have been his. And he was such a fruitful young tree or fruitful branch in spite of all his afflictions, all the trials that he went through, all the reasons he should have turned his back on God and said, enough, God's word is not true. Because, as I mentioned last week, when Joseph was just maybe a young teenager, he had those two dreams that one day all of his brethren and his mother and father, and his mother Rachel was dead, but his mother, you might say, in-law, Leah, was still alive, would one day reverence and bow down to him. And this was before he was even 17 years old, maybe when he was in his mid-teens, that he had these two dreams. They were absolutely certain because God gave them to him twice. But when he was 17, as I mentioned last week, he was sold into slavery. He was stripped of his robe and he was sent all on his own into a foreign land as a slave to the Ishmaelites. And then he was accused of rape and thrown into prison, where it seemed that no one knew he was even there, where it seemed that there was no hope and everyone had forgotten about him. Yet Joseph walked with God and maintained his integrity, and God elevated him to the position of the prime minister, if I could put it in that way, of the whole of Egypt, because of God's hands being on him. And another reason why it's so important for us to look at this, that I've touched on already, is not only the example of faith, but it's this question of our fruit persisting and abiding. You see, we are all called, aren't we, in the same way that Joseph was a fruitful branch. We are too called, aren't we, to be fruitful branches to Christ. This is our very core purpose, isn't it? And a measure of how we are walking as Christians. You know, where he says in John chapter 15, he says of us, Christ says this, I, that is Christ, am the true vine, and my Father is a husbandman. Every branch in me that beareth not fruit, he taketh away. And every branch that beareth fruit, he purgeth it. That is, he cleanses, he brings it through affliction, that it might bring forth more fruit. You see, what the intent of God is, of the Godhead, the triune Godhead, is that we would bring forth fruit. As a preacher said this week, more fruit and much fruit. And Joseph did that, didn't he? As we're told in the scriptures here in Genesis 49, despite his circumstances, he was one of those trees of fruit that was just, branches were weighed down with fruit. How did he do this? And that's what I'd like to briefly talk about tonight. And well, it's not complicated, but it's worth us dwelling on this night, as there's nothing more beautiful, is there, than a fruitful Christian who is walking in the way that God has appointed to us and has won the race. Well, if I might do this really briefly tonight, and first of all say that it was in spite of great affliction. He says back in Genesis 49, in verse 23, after the prophetic description, the insightful description of Joseph, he says, the archers have sorely grieved him and shot at him and hated him. Isn't that such an apt description of Joseph's life? Suddenly the archers have seemed to zero in on him. It's rather like an army on a battlefield, and there is a whole number of soldiers lined up and all various people. But suddenly the archers concentrate their fire, their arrows, on one area, maybe one individual. And Joseph has been sorely grieved and shot at him and hated him. They have focused their grievous darts at him with great malice, and it seems to have been one thing after another that has come at him that seems to have just constantly hated him. And now, as I mentioned last week, there are some that say, well, Joseph was something of a spoiled brat, and he was brash and proud and boastful. He was a favoured child, and really he got what was coming against him. Well, that's one view. Another view was that Joseph was actually a very godly young man who walked in the way that his father and that the Lord had appointed. He instinctively hated evil, and there's evidence of that when he was in prison, and his response to this beautiful woman in the house of Potiphar, whom he could have committed adultery with, but he fled because he feared God and loved him. And just dwell on that for a moment. He was just a teenager, maybe in his early 20s. We don't know how long passed until this happened. But he was just a young man, far from home, without the scriptures. Remember, this is Genesis 49. He didn't have the scriptures. He had no godly company with him, probably. There were no other Israelites there. There was none of his brothers, none of his father to oversee him, yet he kept the ways of God. And as always, another evidence he was a godly man was the response of the ungodly, that they hated him, and he became a target of their fiery arrows. And isn't that something that we're told that we must do as well? Above all, taking the shield of faith, wherewith you shall be able to quench all the fiery darts of the wicked one, of the devil, whose archers fire fiery darts at us. And these were targeted at Joseph. He went through so many dark experiences, didn't he? And I wonder if two things that might have been anguish, or a number of things that might have been of anguish to his soul. The cruelty of his own brothers, that they first of all stripped him of the robe when they caught him and threw him in the hole. They took away that sign of his father's love. And then, when he was in anguish of soul in the pit, his own brothers plotting his murder, then plotting to him be sold, they hardened their heart and they would not respond to him. That must have been such a grievous dart to his soul. It's really interesting, and I'm grateful to someone else pointing this out, but in Genesis 42, when his brothers come to Egypt to buy bread, when Joseph appears, I guess, like an Egyptian, they didn't recognize him. They would never have thought that Joseph would have been in fulfillment of the dreams, elevated to the Lord of the kingdom, second only to Pharaoh. But after they had been caught out, and suddenly they were in trouble with Joseph because of the theft of some of their property, and they said, it says in chapter 42 and verse 21, and they said one to another, we are verily guilty concerning our brother, in that we saw the anguish of his soul when he besought us, and we would not hear. Therefore, this chastisement is upon us. Isn't that interesting? We saw the anguish of his soul when he was lying in the pit, and they were having a meal outside, eating, thinking, what are we going to do with this brother that we want nothing to do with? He besought them. He was in anguish of soul in the pit there. And what did his brothers do? They discussed whether to murder him over a meal, and instead they decided to sell him to Ishmael. But above all, they would not hear their brother's anguish as he cried to them. What a dart that alone must have been to them. And it's interesting, isn't it, that the brothers subsequently received that back to them. They said one to another, we are very guilty concerning our brother. All of them acknowledged, we have blood on our hands, the blood of our brother. And above all, that we hardened our hearts to his cry. And that's what the description here in chapter 49 says. The archers have sorely grieved him. And then I wonder, when Joseph was in prison and the butler, the cupbearer to Pharaoh was there, and then the baker, and Joseph interprets their dreams, and he says to the cupbearer, but remember me when you get out of prison, according to God's word. And 3 days later he got out of prison. But he forgot Joseph, and for 2 years Joseph lay neglected and in prison. And how that must have grieved him. And I wonder, and I think Psalm 105 supports this a little bit, how I wonder whether he might have thought, is God's word really true? Were those dreams really true to me? That indeed I am going to somehow be made elevated, and my brethren will bow down to me, that my father and my mother-in-law, that I will see them again, but here I am languishing in prison and no one knows I'm here. Is God's word true? I trust that we would never say such a thing as that, and I actually believe that Joseph did not, because we see what happened and how the word of the Lord tried him, but it refined him. And of course Joseph knew that it was true, but he didn't know how it would come about. But I wonder again if the archers sorely grieved him and mocked him in his thoughts and cast doubt in his mind, saying, "Is this true?" And they hated him, and how for his love they were his enemies, and they grievously treated him. And isn't it heartening to our souls that the Lord knew all this, didn't he? As his father recounts his experience, we find that God knew all of that which Joseph was going through. It wasn't unknown to him, but God had ordained it and allowed it. The word of the Lord was trying him, despite the archers, but by the shield of faith, he was able to quench the fiery darts of the wicked. He was sorely grieved by them, but his faith stood firm. He was willing, he was convinced that what God had said was true, but what he didn't know was how long, and indeed he didn't know how. He had no idea at all. He was sorely grieved, languishing for 2 years in prison, and his faith failed not. It's easy with us, with hindsight, to see, well, Joseph, it's only 2 years. Just be patient, and God's time will come. But we hadn't been through all those experiences that he went through. But do you see how God allowed him to go through these fiery trials? And we might say, why was that God should allow such things? Well, doesn't, as I read in John 15, show us exactly why? He says, doesn't he, that and every branch that beareth fruit, he purgeth it, that it might bring forth more fruit. And how does God purge us? Isn't it normally through trial that he does those things, those fiery trials that refine our faith in the way that gold is refined by trial, that our faith is made something purer, something finer and wonderful, fit for a royal king, as no king is worthy of 1 carat gold, are they, if I could put it that way? They're worthy, aren't they, for the purest possible gold. There was a lovely lady who used to go to our assembly in Stroud Green who had been through much trial, having been in a Muslim family and marriage and then been converted, truly converted. She was treated cruelly by her Muslim husband for many years. And then he was converted in his latter days and repented of all the affliction had put upon his wife, rather like in the same way that Joseph's brethren did that also. He did the same, but he truly was converted and went to glory, and they were reconciled wonderfully. But that was many years before she was in our assembly. But I tell you, what a wonderful woman there was. There was a goldenness to her faith, because it had been refined through fire, through trial, and how apt and ready she was for the works of God. And that's what Joseph was doing. God had a great work for him to do. But first, his faith was being refined. He was grievously hated by the archers. But, verse 24, and secondly and finally this evening, how did he stand? How could he have endured such things? As I remind you, he was only 17 when he was sold into slavery. And he must have been no later than his mid-20s, I'm surmising, when he was now cast in prison. How his life seemed to be ended. How did he endure? Well, verse 24, but his bow abode in strength, and the arms of his hands were made strong by the hands of the mighty God of Jacob. From thence is the shepherd, the stone of Israel, even by the God of thy father, who shall help thee, and by the Almighty, who shall bless thee. How was it that Joseph stood? It wasn't by his strength. Isn't that a very simple thing first to say? It was by the strength of God that he was able to endure, because though Joseph didn't know it, he was being made strong by God himself. And in fact, as we looked last week, there were many indications that God was with him, that God blessed him in everything that he did. Why was that? That was the hand of God. That wasn't Joseph, but God was with him. He was making the arms of his hands strong. That was how Joseph endured. Jacob had no doubt at all. When he saw the miracle of the dreams being fulfilled, he knew that it was the same God who had helped him, who had helped his son Joseph. No doubt when Jacob cried when he met Joseph for the first time, when they were restored before Joseph died, one of the greatest joys to his soul must have been that Joseph was still walking with God. It's what in 3 John, the writer of the Epistle of John says. He says, I have no greater joy than to hear that my children walk in truth. That's verse 4 of 3 John. I have no greater joy than to hear that my children walk in truth. And if that's what a man might say, isn't it true that God himself would also say that too? What is it that God takes joy in? That we are walking in truth, that we are believing what he is saying. He takes joy in that, and he upholds us. I love this phrase, and do make a study of it, because the language is complicated, but there's depth and deliberate meaning in the way it's translated. But the arms of his hands were made strong by the hands of the mighty God of Jacob. It's slightly hard to understand exactly what that means, but his arms were, so how was it that Joseph's hands continued to work and were raised up to where he was? It's because his arms were made strong by the hands of God. It's slightly something of a tongue twister, but perhaps this might illustrate it. In 2 Kings in chapter 13, there's no need to flick here if you're not familiar with the scriptures, but I thought there's a great illustration of what this might mean for someone's arms of their hands to be made strong. And you might have various different translations of it in front of you. But when Elisha was an old man, the king of Israel at that time came to see him. And now Elisha, in verse 14, was fallen sick of the sickness wherewith he died. And Joash the king of Israel came down unto him and wept over his face and said, O my father, the chariot of Israel, and the horsemen thereof. And Elisha said unto him, Take bow and arrows. And he took them up, bow and arrows. So do you remember, Joseph abode in strength because of God. And he said unto him, and he said to the king of Israel in verse 16, Put thine hand upon the bow. And he put his hand upon it. And Elisha put his hands upon the king's hands. And he said, Open the window eastward. And he opened up. Then Elisha said, Shoot. And he shot. And he said, The arrow of the Lord's deliverance. You see, Joash's hands were on the bow. He went to shoot it, but Elisha then put his hands over the top of Joash's hands. And though Elisha was then an old man and he was sick, so he didn't have bodily strength, but what he had was spiritual strength. He had the word of God. He put his hands on Joash's hands, and it was that is Elisha's hands, that made Joash's arms and hands strong and able to shoot an arrow that would be the arrow of the Lord's deliverances. And that's just what Jacob is saying of Joseph, that his hands, the arms of his hands, were made strong by the hands of the mighty God of Jacob. Isn't it a thrilling title that is given, that Jacob gives to God then? He's not elevating his own name, Jacob, in saying that, but the same God that has been mighty to save and to deliver me, Jacob, has also been your God. Verse 25, even by the God of my father, who shall help thee, and by the Almighty. What a name for God, isn't it? How was it that Joseph stood? Well, we might say it was easy, because he was strengthened, not by his own strength, but by the mighty God of Jacob. The Almighty was with him. See, Joseph, all those years where you felt on your own, where you felt forsaken, hated, where you were sorely grieved of man, you were held in the hollow of the hand of God. The Almighty himself was with you, strengthening you, overseeing you. The hand of God was with you. And how Joseph knew that to be true, and how, above all, it would have thrilled his soul, his heart, to be able to share this with his brethren, not to just enjoy the deliverance of God on his own, but also to experience it and testify of it before his own father, before Leah, and before his brethren, that they together might see the deliverance and the mighty hand of God, that God might have the glory and be glorified through this. But what was it that was necessary of Joseph? And this is my last point tonight before I conclude. And it was, wasn't it, that he had to believe God, what God had said to be true. When you look in Hebrews 11 at the examination of the great cloud of witnesses and how it was from Abraham to Enoch, etc., throughout all the saints that have preceded us, what is the one thing that he says about them that was necessary for them to please God, that God would accomplish his will? It was this, wasn't it? By faith. By faith. Nothing else was added to that, was it? But it was that they believed what God had said to be true. And as I mentioned earlier, Joseph didn't have much. He didn't have the whole scriptures, did he? But he had the accounts of his fathers. He had the dreams that God had given him, but he believed that to be true with all of his heart. And isn't that just the same case for us today? Are we not saved by faith alone? Yes, faith that is evidenced by our works. And if we say that we believe in the Lord Jesus Christ and yet walk as though Jesus was just a man and not a God, then of course our faith is not true. But we are saved by faith in Christ alone, aren't we? This is the way that we're saved. And this is what is precious to the Lord, that we might believe on him with all of our hearts and not be shaken by our circumstances. Well, if I may conclude by one final scripture. You see, Joseph's arm, his strength didn't fail because God was with him through all those trials and all that time. And we can all say amen to that, can't we? How is it that we endure? How is it that we stand? It is not by our strength, isn't it? As Ephesians 6 ends, stand, be strong in the Lord and in the power of his might. And how mighty his right hand is. My final scripture is in Exodus chapter 15. And after 400 years later, because that's how long the people of Israel were now going to be afflicted in Egypt. See, the Lord wasn't leading them initially to Egypt for a land of luxury, but they were going to be cruelly treated as a whole people there. But while they're there, they would become the nation of Israel, from which God would send Moses and bring them out to the promised land. But when that happens, Moses sings this wonderful song in Exodus chapter 14 and from verse 4 to 6. I'll just read that little section. Exodus chapter 15 and verse 4 to 6. And notice what he says. I'll read from verse 2. It's such a wonderful song. The Lord is my strength and song, and he is become my salvation. He is my God, and I'll prepare him an habitation, my father's God, and I will exalt him. The Lord is a man of war. The Lord is his name. Pharaoh's hosts and his chariots hath he cast into the sea. His chosen captains are also drowned in the Red Sea. See, all their strength failed. The depths had covered them. They sank into the bottom as a stone. Thy right hand, O Lord, is become glorious in power. Thy right hand, O Lord, hath dashed in pieces the enemy. Isn't that just what Joseph could say? Thy right hand, O Lord, in upholding me, in bringing me here through great trials, has become glorious in strength, in power. Thy right hand, not mine, O Lord, thy right hand hath dashed in pieces the enemy. Be strong in the Lord and in the power of his might. Thank God we have these scriptures, don't we? Which Joseph didn't have. But he had the same God that we have, don't we? And he was the one whose hands made Joseph's arms strong, that they didn't fall, that they didn't fail. More than that, they overcame. By faith, Joseph believed in God, and he is a fruitful bough, the fruit of which overspilled the boundaries of the habitation where he was, and bore much fruit to the glory of God, and how souls rejoiced at that. And can we not also have the same aspirations for ourselves, that we might be fruitful branches, that, as another has said, that we might bear fruit, more fruit, and much fruit, that many might see and say, thy right hand, O Lord, is become glorious in power. Thy right hand, O Lord, hath dashed in pieces the enemy. Amen.